A prime minister is the most senior minister of cabinet in the executive branch of government, often in a parliamentary or semi-presidential system. In many systems, the prime minister selects and may dismiss other members of the cabinet, and allocates posts to members within the government. In most systems, the prime minister is the presiding member and chairman of the cabinet. In a minority of systems, notably in semi-presidential systems of government, a prime minister is the official who is appointed to manage the civil service and execute the directives of the head of state. In parliamentary systems fashioned after the Westminster system, the prime minister is the presiding and actual head of government and head of the executive branch. In such systems, the head of state or the head of state's official representative usually holds a largely ceremonial position, although often with reserve powers. The prime minister is often, but not always, a member of the legislature of the lower house thereof and is expected with other ministers to ensure the passage of bills through the legislature. In some monarchies, the monarch may also exercise executive powers that are constitutionally vested in the crown and may be exercised without the approval of Parliament. As well as being head of government, a prime minister may have other roles or titles. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, for example, is also First Lord of the Treasury and Minister for the Civil Service. Prime ministers may take other ministerial posts. For example, during the Second World War, Winston Churchill was also Minister of Defense, and in the current cabinet of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu also serves as Minister of Communications, Foreign Affairs, Regional Cooperation, Economy and Interior Etymology. The first actual usage of the term Prime Minister or Premier Ministre was used by Cardinal Richelieu when in 1625 he was named to head the Royal Council as Prime Minister of France. Louis XIV and his descendants generally attempted to avoid giving this title to the chief ministers. The term prime minister in the sense that we know it originated in the 18th century in the United Kingdom when members of Parliament disparagingly used the title in reference to Sir Robert Walpole. Over time, the title became honorific and remains so in the 21st century. History. Origins. The monarchs of England and the United Kingdom had ministers in whom they placed special trust and who were regarded as the head of the government. Examples were Thomas Cromwell under Henry VIII, William Cecil, Lord Burleigh under Elizabeth I, Clarendon under Charles II and Godolphin under Queen Anne. These ministers held a variety of formal posts, but were commonly known as the minister, the chief minister, the first minister, and finally the prime minister. The power of these ministers depended entirely on the personal favor of the monarch. Although managing the parliament was among the necessary skills of holding high office, they did not depend on a parliamentary majority for their power. Although there was a cabinet, it was appointed entirely by the monarch, and the monarch usually presided over its meetings. When the monarch grew tired of a first minister, he or she could be dismissed, or worse. Cromwell was executed and Clarendon driven into exile when they lost favor. Kings sometimes divided power equally between two or more ministers to prevent one minister from becoming too powerful. Late in Anne's reign, for example, the Tory ministers Harley and St. John shared power. Development. In the mid-17th century, after the English Civil War, Parliament strengthened its position relative to the monarch, then gained more power through the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and passage of the Bill of Rights in 1689. The monarch could no longer establish any law or impose any tax without its permission, and thus the House of Commons became a part of the government. It is at this point that a modern style of prime minister begins to emerge. A tipping point in the evolution of the prime ministership came with the death of Anne in 1714 and the accession of George I to the throne. George spoke no English, spent much of his time at his home in Hanover, and had neither knowledge of nor interest in the details of English government. In these circumstances it was inevitable that the king's first minister would become the de facto head of the government. From 1721 this was the Whig politician Robert Walpole, who held office for 21 years. Walpole chaired cabinet meetings, appointed all the other ministers, dispensed the royal patronage and packed the House of Commons with his supporters. Under Walpole, the doctrine of cabinet solidarity developed. Walpole required that no minister other than himself have private dealings with the king, and also that when the cabinet had agreed on a policy, all ministers must defend it in public or resign. As a later Prime Minister, Lord Melbourne, said, "It matters not what we say, gentlemen, so long as we all say the same thing." Walpole always denied that he was Prime Minister, and throughout the 18th century parliamentarians and legal scholars continued to deny that any such position was known to the Constitution. George II and George III made strenuous efforts to reclaim the personal power of the monarch. But the increasing complexity and expensive government meant that a minister who could command the loyalty of the Commons was increasingly necessary. The long tenure of the wartime Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, combined with the mental illness of George III, consolidated the power of the post. The title was first referred to on government documents during the administration of Benjamin Disraeli but did not appear in the formal British order of precedence until 1905. The prestige of British institutions in the 19th century and the growth of the British Empire saw the British model of cabinet government, headed by a prime minister, widely copied, both in other European countries and in British colonial territories as they developed self-government. In some places alternative titles such as Premier, Chief Minister, First Minister of State, President of the Council, or Chancellor were adopted, but the essentials of the office were the same. Modern usage. By the late 20th century, the majority of the world's countries had a prime minister or equivalent minister, holding office under either a constitutional monarchy or a ceremonial president. The main exceptions to this system have been the United States and the presidential republics in Latin America, modeled on the U.S. system, in which the president directly exercises executive authority. Bahrain's Prime Minister, Sheikh Khalifa bin Salman Al Khalifa, has been in the post since 1970, making him the longest-serving non-elected prime minister. In republics and in monarchies, the post of prime minister may be encountered both in constitutional monarchies and in parliamentary republics in which the head of state is an elected official. Ireland, Pakistan, Portugal, Montenegro, Croatia, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia and Turkey. See also First Minister, Premier, Chief Minister, Chancellor, Taoiseach, Staatsminister, and Secretary of State. Alternative titles usually equivalent in meaning to, or translated as, Prime Minister. This contrasts with the presidential system, in which the president is both the head of state and the head of the government. In some presidential or semi-presidential systems, such as those of France, Russia or South Korea, the Prime Minister is an official generally appointed by the President but usually approved by the legislature and responsible for carrying out the directives of the President and managing the civil service. The head of government of the People's Republic of China is referred to as the Premier of the State Council, and the Premier of the Republic of China is also appointed by the President, but requires no approval by the legislature. Appointment of the Prime Minister of France requires no approval by the Parliament either, but the Parliament may force the resignation of the government. In these systems, it is possible for the President and the Prime Minister to be from different political parties if the legislature is controlled by a party different from that of the President. When it arises, such a state of affairs is usually referred to as cohabitation. Entry into office. In parliamentary systems, a prime minister may enter into office by several means. The head of state appoints a prime minister of the personal choice. Example, France, where the president has the power to appoint the prime minister of their choice. Though the National Assembly can force a government to resign, they cannot nominate or appoint a new candidate. While in practice most prime ministers under the Westminster system are the leaders of the largest party in Parliament. Technically, the appointment of the Prime Minister is a prerogative exercised by the head of state. In India, the prime ministerial candidate must be a member of Parliament, either Lok Sabha or Rajya Sabha. No parliamentary vote takes place on who is forming a government. However, as the government will have to outline its legislative program to Parliament in, for example, the speech from the throne. The speech is sometimes used to test parliamentary support. A defeat of the speech is taken to mean a loss of confidence and so requires either a new draft, resignation, or a request for a dissolution of Parliament. Until the early 20th century, governments, when defeated in a general election, remained in power until the speech from the throne was defeated and then resigned. No government has done so for 100 years, though Edward Heath in 1974 did delay his resignation while he explored whether he could form a government with Liberal Party support. In such systems, unwritten constitutional conventions often outline the order in which people are asked to form a government. If the Prime Minister resigns after a general election, the monarch usually asks the leader of the opposition to form a government. Where, however, a resignation occurs during a parliament session, the monarch will ask another member of the government to form a government. While previously the monarch had some leeway in whom to ask, all British political parties now elect their leaders. The last time the monarch had a choice over the appointment occurred in 1963 when the Earl of Home was asked to become Prime Minister ahead of Rab. Butler. During the period between the time it is clear that the incumbent government has been defeated at a general election, and the actual swearing-in of the new Prime Minister by the monarch or Governor-General, that person is referred to as the Prime Minister-elect or Prime Minister-designate. Neither term is strictly correct from a constitutional point of view, but they have wide acceptance. In a situation in which a ruling party elects or appoints a new leader, the incoming leader will usually be referred as Prime Minister in waiting. An example of this situation was in 2003 in Canada when Paul Martin was elected leader of the Liberal Party of Canada while Jean Chrétien was still Prime Minister. The head of state appoints a Prime Minister who has a set time scale within which they must gain a vote of confidence. The head of state appoints the leader of the political party with the majority of the seats in the Parliament as Prime Minister. If no party has a majority, then the leader of the party with a plurality of seats is given an exploratory mandate to receive the confidence of the Parliament within 3 days. If this is not possible, then the leader of the party with the second highest seat number is given the exploratory mandate. If this fails, then the leader of the third largest party is given it, and so on. The head of state nominates a candidate for Prime Minister who is then submitted to Parliament for approval before appointment as Prime Minister. Example, Spain, where the King sends a nomination to Parliament for approval. Also Germany, where under the German Basic Law the Bundestag votes on a candidate nominated by the federal president. In these cases, Parliament can choose another candidate who then would be appointed by the head of state. Parliament nominates a candidate who the head of state is then constitutionally obliged to appoint as Prime Minister. Example, Ireland, where the President appoints the Taoiseach on the nomination of Dáil Éireann. Also Japan, direct election by popular vote, nomination by a state officeholder other than the head of state to his her representative, by the parliament if an absolute majority of the members of parliament does not vote no. Constitutions. The position, power and status of prime ministers differ depending on the age of the constitution. Australia's constitution makes no mention of a Prime Minister of Australia. Bangladesh's constitution clearly outlines the functions and powers of the Prime Minister, and also details the process of his/her appointment and dismissal. The People's Republic of China constitution set a premier just one place below the National People's Congress in China. Premier readers in Chinese. Canada's constitution, being a mixed or hybrid constitution, originally did not make any reference whatsoever to a prime minister, with her or his specific duties and method of appointment instead dictated by a convention. In the Constitution Act, 1982, passing reference to a Prime Minister of Canada is added, though only regarding the composition of conferences of federal and provincial first ministers. Czech Republic's constitution clearly outlines the functions and powers of the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, and also details the process of his/her appointment and dismissal. Germany's basic law lists the powers, functions and duties of the Federal Chancellor. Greece's constitution lists the powers, functions and duties of the Prime Minister of Greece. India's constitution lists the powers, functions and duties of the Prime Minister of India. Ireland's constitution provides for the office of Taoiseach in detail, listing powers, functions and duties. Italy's constitution lists the powers, functions and duties of the President of the Council of Ministers. Japan's constitution lists the powers, functions and duties of the Prime Minister of Japan. The Republic of Korea's constitution sections 86-87 list the powers, functions and duties of the Prime Minister of the Republic of Korea. Malta's constitution lists the powers, functions and duties of the Prime Minister of Malta. Malaysia's constitution lists the powers, functions and duties of the Prime Minister of Malaysia. Norway's constitution lists the powers, functions and duties of the Prime Minister of Norway. Pakistan's constitution lists the powers, functions and duties of the Prime Minister of Pakistan. Spain's constitution regulates the appointment, dismissal, powers, functions and duties of the President of the government. Thailand's constitution lists the powers, functions and duties of the Prime Minister of Thailand. The United Kingdom's constitution, being uncodified and largely unwritten, makes no mention of a prime minister, though it had de facto existed for centuries. Its first mention in official state documents did not occur until the first decade of the 20th century. Accordingly, it is often said not to exist. Indeed, there are several instances of Parliament declaring this to be the case. The Prime Minister sits in the cabinet solely by virtue of occupying another office, either First Lord of the Treasury, or more rarely Chancellor of the Exchequer. Ukraine's constitution lists the powers, functions and duties of the Prime Minister of Ukraine. Exit from office. Most prime ministers in parliamentary systems are not appointed for a specific term in office and in effect may remain in power through a number of elections and parliaments. For example, Margaret Thatcher was only ever appointed Prime Minister on one occasion, in 1979. She remained continuously in power until 1990, though she used the assembly of each House of Commons after a general election to reshuffle her cabinet. Some states, however, have a term of office of the Prime Minister linked to the period in office of the Parliament. Hence, the Irish Taoiseach is formally renominated after every general election. The position of Prime Minister is normally chosen from the political party that commands majority of seats in the lower House of Parliament. In parliamentary systems, governments are generally required to have the confidence of the lower House of Parliament. Where they lose a vote of confidence, have a motion of no confidence passed against them, or where they lose apply. Most constitutional systems require either. The latter in effect allows the government to appeal the opposition of Parliament to the electorate. However, in many jurisdictions a head of state may refuse a parliamentary dissolution, requiring the resignation of the Prime Minister and his or her government. In most modern parliamentary systems, the Prime Minister is the person who decides when to request a parliamentary dissolution. Older constitutions often vest this power in the cabinet. In the United Kingdom, for example, the tradition whereby it is the Prime Minister who requests a dissolution of Parliament dates back to 1918. Prior to then, it was the entire government that made the request. Similarly, though the modern 1937 Irish Constitution grants to the Taoiseach the right to make the request, the earlier 1922 Irish Free State Constitution vested the power in the Executive Council. In Australia, the Prime Minister is expected to step down if he loses the majority support of his/her party under a spill motion, as have many such as Tony Abbott, Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd. Titles. In the Russian constitution, the Prime Minister is actually titled Chairman of the Government, while the Irish Prime Minister is called the Taoiseach, and in Israel he is Rosh HaMamshala, meaning head of the government. In many cases, though commonly used, Prime Minister is not the official title of the office holder. The Spanish Prime Minister is the President of the government. Other common forms include President of the Council of Ministers, President of the Executive Council, or Minister-President. In the Nordic countries, the Prime Minister is called Statsminister, meaning Minister of State. In federations, the head of government of subnational entities such as provinces is most commonly known as the Premier, Chief Minister, Governor or Minister-President. The convention in the English language is to call nearly all national heads of government Prime Minister, regardless of the correct title of the head of government as applied in his or her respective country. The few exceptions to the rule are Germany and Austria, whose heads of government titles are almost always translated as Chancellor, Monaco, whose head of government is referred to as the Minister of State, and Vatican City, for which the head of government is titled the Secretary of State. In the case of Ireland, the head of government is occasionally referred to as the Taoiseach by English speakers. A standout case is the President of Iran, who is not actually a head of state, but the head of the government of Iran. He is referred to as President in both the Persian and English languages. In non-Commonwealth countries, the Prime Minister may be entitled to the style of Excellency like a President. In some Commonwealth countries, Prime Ministers and former Prime Ministers are styled Right Honourable due to the position. For example, in the Prime Minister of Canada. In the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister and former Prime Ministers may appear to also be styled Right Honourable. However, this is not due to the position as head of government, but as a privilege of being current members of Her Majesty's Most Honourable Privy Council. In the UK, where devolved government is in place, the leaders of the Scottish, Northern Irish and Welsh governments are styled First Minister. In India, the Prime Minister is referred to as Pradhan Mantri, meaning Prime Minister. In Pakistan, the Prime Minister is referred to as Wazir-e-Azam, meaning Grand Vizier. Organizational structure. The Prime Minister's executive office is usually called the Office of the Prime Minister. In the case of the Canada and other Commonwealth countries, it is called Cabinet Office in United Kingdom. Some Prime Minister's office do include the role of cabinet. In other countries, it is called the Prime Minister's Department of the Prime Minister, and Cabinet is for Australia. Description of the role. Wilfred Martens, who served as Prime Minister of Belgium, described his role as follows. First of all, the Prime Minister must listen a lot, and when deep disagreements occur, he must suggest a solution to the matter. This can be done in different ways. Sometimes, during the discussion, I note the elements of the problem and think of a proposal I can formulate to the Council. The Secretary taking notes. The ministers then insist on changing game ages. The Prime Minister can also make a proposal which leaves enough room for amendments in order to keep the current discussion on the right tracks. When a solution must be found in order to reach a consensus, he can force one or two ministers to join or resign. Lists of Prime Ministers. The following table groups the list of past and present Prime Ministers and details information available in those lists.